Something is seriously wrong, Lillian Parker whispered, one hand locked around the side of her abdomen. Dr. Evan Mercer didn't look up from the chart. Across the emergency room, monitors beeped, wheels squeaked, and someone behind a curtain was crying. Lillian sat curled in a plastic chair, sweating through her blouse, trying not to make a scene. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Dr. Mercer sighed like she had interrupted him. "You're fine," he said. "Probably stress or indigestion. Go home." Lillian blinked at him. "I can't stand up straight." The pain moved. It feels like he lifted one hand, cutting her off. "Miss Parker, you've been evaluated." But he hadn't touched her stomach. He hadn't ordered a scan. He hadn't even asked about the surgery she'd tried to mention 3 times. A nurse beside him shifted her weight. Her name badge read Valerie. She looked from Lillian to the chart, then back again. "Doctor," Valerie said carefully. Her pulse was still. "I said discharge," Dr. Mercer snapped. The words landed loud enough for the patient across the room to stare. Lillian's face burned. She lowered her eyes, suddenly ashamed for insisting, ashamed for being alone, ashamed for not knowing the right medical words to make someone believe her. Dr. Mercer tore the discharge papers from the printer and held them out. "Go home, rest, hydrate." Lillian reached for the papers with shaking fingers. When she stood, the room tilted. She grabbed the wall, knees buckling. Behind her, she heard Valerie whisper to another nurse, "Did he even order labs?" The other nurse didn't answer. Lillian made it outside by leaning against every hallway rail. She was too weak to drive, so she called a rideshare and folded herself into the back seat, biting down on her sleeve to stay quiet. Halfway home, the pain sharpened so suddenly she couldn't breathe. Her phone slipped from her hand. The driver shouted, "Ma'am? Ma'am, stay with me." Then darkness broke open into sirens. The next thing Lillian heard was a paramedic yelling, blood pressures crashing. Hospital doors burst apart. Her stretcher flew through the same emergency entrance she had just been sent out of. Bright ceiling lights streaked over Lillian's head as the stretcher slammed through double doors. Voices overlapped around her. BP dropping. "Get surgery on the line. Where are the scans?" Lillian tried to focus, but everything came in fragments, fluorescent lights, running shoes pounding against the floor, the metallic taste in her mouth. A surgeon walking beside her grabbed a tablet from a nurse and froze mid-step. "What the hell?" he muttered. He looked up sharply. "Who discharged her?" For half a second, nobody answered. Then, Nurse Valerie said quietly, "Dr. Mercer." The silence that followed felt heavier than the panic around them. The surgeon's expression changed instantly. "Move faster." Or now. The stretcher lurched again. Lillian drifted in and out while staff rushed beside her. Every bump sent pain tearing through her stomach. Somewhere nearby, someone was calling for blood. And through the haze, one thought kept repeating in her mind, "I told him." Earlier that evening, she had almost stayed home. Her 10-year-old son Mason stood in the kitchen doorway while she held her side, trying to pretend she was okay. "You don't have to go," he said quietly. Hospitals terrified him ever since his father died there 3 years earlier, after a sudden heart attack. Lillian forced a smile. "I'll be home in an hour." Now all she could think about was whether she had lied to him. The surgeon flipped through her chart while they ran. "She had abdominal surgery before?" he asked. Valerie nodded once. She tried telling him. Another memory flashed through Lillian's mind. Dr. Mercer barely listening while she explained her previous intestinal complications. "We can't scan every stomachache," he had said without even looking at her. Valerie had tried again. "Should we at least order imaging?" No. The answer had been immediate. Now, inside pre-op, masked staff surrounded Lillian while machines beeped faster and faster. Someone adjusted her oxygen mask. Someone else said, "We're losing time." Lillian turned weakly toward the surgeon. "Am I dying?" Nobody answered directly. The anesthesiologist leaned over her. "We're going to take care of you." As darkness crept over her vision, Lillian heard a voice near the doorway say, "If this had ruptured another hour later." The sentence never finished. Everything went black. When Lillian opened her eyes again, she thought for a second she was still dreaming. The room was dim. Machines hummed beside her bed. Her throat burned from the breathing tube they had removed hours earlier. Then, she saw her mother sitting in the corner, crying silently into both hands. "Mom?" Lillian rasped. Her mother shot upright and grabbed the nurse call button. "She's awake." "Oh my God! She's awake!" Pain exploded through Lillian's abdomen when she tried to move. She looked down and saw thick bandages across her stomach. "What happened to me?" Her mother's eyes filled again. "You almost died." Over the next hour, pieces came back slowly. Emergency surgery. A bowel obstruction. Internal infection beginning to spread. 3 days had passed. Her phone sat on the tray beside the bed, overflowing with missed calls from work, school staff, and neighbors who had picked up Mason while she was in surgery. Late that evening, Nurse Valerie slipped quietly into the room after her shift ended. "You weren't supposed to leave that night," she said softly. Lillian stared at her. Valerie looked toward the hallway before continuing. "Multiple nurses pushed back on your discharge. One of them documented possible obstruction symptoms. Then why did he send me home?" Valerie hesitated too long. The next morning, Lillian requested her records. She expected mistakes. What she found made her hands shake. Patient appears anxious, symptoms exaggerated, stable for discharge. Then another line, patient declined additional testing. "No," Lillian whispered. "That never happened." Her sister read the chart over her shoulder and swore under her breath. By that night, screenshots of the records were online. Her sister's post spread fast after another woman commented underneath, "Dr. Mercer did the same thing to me last year." 2 days later, hospital administration invited Lillian to what they called a private discussion. The administrator greeted her with a rehearsed smile. "We believe there may have been some miscommunication," he said carefully. "And naturally, we'd like to help with your medical expenses." Lillian looked at him. "You mean if I stay quiet?" "That's not what I said." But it was. As she left the office on shaky legs, conversations stopped around the nurse's station. Some staff looked away immediately. Others quietly said, "I'm sorry." In the parking garage, Valerie hurried after her. She looked terrified. "You need to see something," she whispered. Lillian frowned. "What?" Valerie swallowed hard. "You need to see what was deleted from your chart." Valerie waited until they were alone in her car before pulling a folded stack of papers from her bag. "I shouldn't even have these," she said nervously. Lillian took the documents carefully. Across the top were electronic chart logs with timestamps running down the side. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then, Valerie pointed to a line near the middle. "Look at the time." Lillian's stomach tightened. The edits had been made after paramedics brought her back to the hospital, after emergency surgery had already started. "He changed the chart?" Lillian asked quietly. Valerie nodded once. Lillian scanned the deleted notes. Severe abdominal guarding. Elevated pulse, sustained. Recommendation, immediate CT imaging. Every warning sign Dr. Mercer claimed wasn't there had originally been documented. And then removed. For several seconds, Lillian couldn't speak. This wasn't a rushed mistake anymore. It looked deliberate. Her lawyer studied the records the next day inside a cramped office stacked with medical files. "If we accuse a senior physician of altering records publicly," he warned, "we need motive. Otherwise, they'll bury this." Valerie sat rigid beside Lillian. "There is a motive." She explained what had been happening inside the ER for months. Administrators were obsessed with wait time rankings before a major funding review. Doctors were pressured constantly to avoid admissions, reduce scans, and clear patients quickly. Mercer became their golden boy, Valerie said bitterly. Fast discharges, fast turnover. Another nurse had even nicknamed his shifts speed rounds. Lillian remembered the waiting room that night. Overcrowded hallways, exhausted nurses, patients lining the walls. Now it looked different. Not chaotic. Rushed, controlled, and dangerous. But the deeper Valerie talked, the more frightened she became. Hospital legal already contacted staff, she admitted. Some people are scared to say anything. One nurse who had questioned Lillian's discharge refused to cooperate entirely. She has kids, Valerie said quietly. She thinks they'll fire her. 3 weeks later, still sore from surgery, Lillian sat under bright studio lights for a local news interview. The reporter laid out printed timelines beside screenshots of Dr. Mercer's notes. "You were documented as refusing further testing," the reporter said carefully. "Did that happen?" "No," Lillian answered. "I begged for help." The interview shifted to images from her surgery recovery, while the reporter read portions of the altered chart aloud. Then suddenly, the producer rushed onto the set holding a phone. Everyone stopped. The producer looked directly at the reporter. The hospital just announced Dr. Mercer resigned effective immediately. At first, the resignation looked like the end of the story. The hospital released a short public statement thanking Dr. Evan Mercer for years of dedicated service and asking for privacy during an internal review. But Lillian's lawyer kept digging. And the deeper they went, the worse it became. During discovery, internal emails surfaced between administrators and senior ER staff sent just weeks before Lillian arrived at the hospital. Admissions numbers were too high. CT scan usage was under review. Emergency room wait times were threatening funding bonuses tied to hospital rankings. One message from administration read, "We must improve throughput immediately." Another warned physicians that unnecessary admissions would be closely monitored. Then, investigators uncovered Mercer's replies. "Half these patients don't need scans," he wrote in one thread. In another, he joked about turning beds over faster than housekeeping. The night Lillian came in, the emergency department had been beyond capacity. Hallway beds were full. Staff had been pressured all evening to move patients out quickly. And when Lillian described severe abdominal pain with a history of intestinal surgery, nurses documented concern immediately. One requested imaging. Another noted worsening symptoms. Mercer overrode them all. He dismissed her as anxious before properly examining her because he believed she would slow down his numbers with another complicated admission. Then, after she collapsed and returned in critical condition, he altered portions of the chart to protect himself. When Lillian finally heard the full timeline, she sat silently for several minutes. The worst part wasn't the surgery. It wasn't the scar stretching across her abdomen. It was realizing how easily someone with authority had decided she wasn't worth listening to. A month later, her lawyer showed her body cam footage from the paramedics who picked her up the night she collapsed in the rideshare. The video shook from movement as medics worked over her unconscious body. One paramedic looked at the discharge paperwork and said sharply, "How was she sent home like this?" Another answered, "I don't know." Lillian replayed that part 3 times. Not because it comforted her, because for weeks she had secretly wondered if Dr. Mercer was right, if maybe she had overreacted, if maybe she really had sounded dramatic. Hearing strangers immediately recognize something was wrong shattered that doubt completely. Her son Mason walked into the room while the footage played. He watched only a few seconds before wrapping both arms around her carefully, terrified of hurting her stitches. "You can't scare me like that again," he whispered. Lillian held him tightly and cried harder than she had since the surgery. A few days later, Valerie visited her apartment carrying coffee and paperwork from the investigation. "I should have pushed harder that night," Valerie said quietly. "I knew something was wrong." Lillian shook her head. "You were the only person who tried." As media coverage spread statewide, more former patients came forward with complaints involving rushed discharges and altered documentation concerns. State investigators opened formal inquiries into hospital policies. Anonymous staff members testified about pressure to reduce admissions before funding reviews. Several lawsuits followed. Mercer lost his hospital privileges pending board review, and malpractice insurers refused continued coverage once evidence tampering entered the investigation. Administrators who once ignored Lillian now avoided reporters waiting outside the hospital entrance. Meanwhile, Lillian, the woman dismissed as anxious and dramatic, stood before a patient safety committee months later, speaking into a microphone, while lawmakers discussed protections against altered electronic medical records. She still tired easily. She still had pain near the incisions some mornings, and the scar across her stomach would never fully fade. But something else disappeared too. The hesitation. The instinct to apologize for speaking up. One evening, months after the investigation began, Lillian opened the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator and looked at the folded discharge papers she had kept from that night. Not because she wanted to remember almost dying, but because they reminded her of something important. She had known something was wrong. And she had been right. The worst part wasn't almost dying, she said quietly. It was how